Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Cocking. I'm the forester for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Northern California along the coast. I'm going to be talking about the Natural Resources Conservation Service and prescribed burning in California. I have three parts to the presentation. The first is about conservation planning and the policy that NRCS uses for planning and how that relates to prescribed burning in Northern California. The second part is about our policy regarding prescribed fire. And the third is about examples, recent examples of prescribed burning in Northern California, that some of which were contracted prescribed burns with NRCS. The Natural Resources Conservation Service is an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We are a federal agency that work with private farmers, ranchers, and non-industrial forest landowners to help conserve natural resources on private lands. We do that by two means. One is technical assistance, wherein we visit properties, speak with landowners, offer them advice or inventory their resources, assess resources, and offer design or specifications for how to treat problems. That work is free for clients if it's NRCS staff that's doing it. Financial assistance programs that we have offer funding to private landowners, non-governmental organizations such as watershed groups, and then tribes to complete the conservation work that they'd like to through applying practices on their property. And those are contractual-based programs. The funding is typically reimbursement-based. NRCS uses a theoretical 9-step planning process to conduct conservation planning. Those 9 steps start with identifying who the client is and where they are. Step 2, determining objectives. What is a broader goal that the client has? Step 3, we inventory resources, determine the baseline conditions using field work of some sort and other tools. This might be done by NRCS staff. It might also be done by what we call a technical service provider. Technical service providers are individuals that can be privately contracted by clients to conduct that type of work. They have to be certified with NRCS, and they go through a program to become TSPs, or technical service providers. Step 4, we analyze the data collected. We formulate alternatives from that analysis. So how many ways can a problem be approached? Step 6, we evaluate those alternatives. And in step 7, we present that to the client, and the client makes a decision about which alternative they want to choose to treat the problems that were identified. In step 8, the client implements the plan on the lands in question. And in step 9, the plan is evaluated whether it worked or not, what worked, what didn't work. So that's the theoretical 9-step process that NRCS uses to do conservation planning. It applies to all of our planning, and all of our practices that are planned typically follow this approach. So use this information how you will. If you're planning to become a technical service provider in the private sector, this information should be at some point presented to you as you go through that process. It might be helpful for you if you're foresters working with other NRCS offices, just to have some sympathy for what the NRCS staff have to document to be able to produce a conservation plan. So another thing that NRCS uses are resource concerns to describe and explain problems. The National Planning and Procedures Handbook, which there's a website for there, lays out this definition for a resource concern: an expected degradation of soil, water, air, plant, or animal resource base to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. It's a colloquial way of saying degradation. In order for an on-the-ground practice or treatment to be able to receive financial assistance from NRCS in a contract format, it must be shown to be treating NRCS resource concerns. So we have to use our practices to treat those resource concerns that are identified degradation of resources. The bottom pictures are some basic examples of resource concerns. The left is the erosion and water quality resource concern evident there in the picture, and the right is a plant compositional resource concern. One we see on the North Coast a lot is invasion of Douglas fir into oak woodland. What resource concerns can be treated with prescribed fire? Pretty much any plant resource concern that is an official resource concern within NRCS can be treated with prescribed fire, among other possible alternative treatments. Excessive biomass fire hazard fuels is definitely one that can be directly treated by prescribed fire. Plant structure and composition can be largely affected by prescribed fire, and sometimes prescribed fire is the best treatment to affect composition, particularly when you're dealing with very small trees, such as in the example on the right. Young Douglas fir in the left-hand picture on the top was burned, and in the picture on the right, you can see that has died. So prescribed fire used there to treat a compositional problem in an oak woodland. Productivity and health of plants is another resource concern that can be affected by prescribed fire. To boost performance in rangelands to improve vigor and growth, or in forest land, and then for the productivity and health of particular plants for cultural uses. Plant pest pressure is another one that could be affected by prescribed fire. Smoke from prescribed fires can be direct insecticide. Other uses of prescribed fire can be used to change the life cycle of pests or what they do. All of these resource concerns are applicable also in forest land, so for you foresters, any of these can apply with regard to prescribed fire. We have animal resource concerns as well. I pulled these two, feed and forage imbalance and degradation of terrestrial habitat. Either of those can be affected by prescribed fire. The one that applies in forest probably more would be the habitat one, but if you were dealing with a grazed forest system, such as oak woodland or a pine savanna type situation, feed and forage imbalance might apply and be affected by prescribed fire. So it's important to remember that prescribed fire is not always the only alternative. Sometimes it is the least cost alternative, and sometimes it is the best alternative, but it's important to present the differences. So once you have your resource concerns identified, you've evaluated the problem, then you can go about planning what will effectively treat the resource concern, solve the problem, or fix the problem. So NRCS uses our standard practices to do that. We have hundreds of standard practices. They all have a code number associated with them. These are some of them that are typical with forest land planning, and in particular the three at the top left there, prescribed burn plans, which is a written plan, fire break, which a lot of firefighters might think of as fire line, and prescribed burning, which is practice code 338, are all often used with prescribed fire. Prescribed burning itself is in there. These other practices below that may be facilitative to prescribed burn planning. They may be preparatory practices before you do a prescribed burn. Certainly fire break or fire line is a practice that facilitates prescribed burning and is often almost essential, unless you have existing line and you don't need to construct any. So these are some of the practices. There are many others out there that may be applicable to any given situation. They have a practice standard that is associated with them that creates some of the specifications that have to be met for these to be effectively implemented and then reimbursed by NRCS. So what programs could be considered for clients if they're thinking about conducting prescribed burning? There are two that I want to go over here. One is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. That's NRCS bread and butter. It's our catch-all. Almost any land use across the country in agriculture or non-industrial forest land or rangeland has an opportunity for funding for conservation through EQIP. These are typically 1 to 3 year contracts. They have to have at least one activity scheduled in each of the years. It could be a 1 year contract with one thing scheduled. It could be a 1 year contract with many things scheduled in 1 year. It could be a 3 year contract with one thing each year. But the important point is that something has to be scheduled and implemented every year of that contract. And so this is important because it relates to flexibility. And with prescribed burning, you might want a long-term window within which to complete a prescribed burn, but you might not know when you're going to get your prescription to implement. And so this presents some limited flexibility with NRCS programs. We're confined to having something scheduled every year of a contract. Now, if you have preparatory practices, then you can do those in the beginning years and then have prescribed burning plan for the final year of a contract. But it can be difficult to work with that kind of structure. We can modify contracts, but that isn't necessarily encouraged by NRCS. Payments under EQIP are for finite amounts like acres or linear feet So you're paid by the acre of the practice, such as prescribed fire. 10 acres is however many dollars per acre that you get paid. And each practice has its own specific payment rate. And then within practices, for different types of scenarios of application of that, there are different rates as well. CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program. This is intended for clients with a long-standing history with NRCS and have completed other successful contracts. It's typically a 5-year contract, so it's a longer time frame. It assumes that annual activity is ongoing by the client to maintain resource concerns on the property in a certain condition. And then there are annual payments through Conservation Stewardship Program for that work. So there's definitely something going on every year of the contract. It doesn't necessarily have to be prescribed fire, but something is happening that the client is implementing that maintains a certain condition on the land. Enhancements can be added to this. This might be prescribed fire at 1 year within the 5 years. It might be for multiple times within 5 years. And there are many different enhancements that have alternative types of treatment associated with them. So prescribed fire might be one choice among many with the enhancements. This program is not as flexible on timelines and delays, even compared to EQIP, which is also not the most flexible program with timelines. And my experience with this program is that it's generally difficult to work with it in forest land because it does assume that there is activity every year of a certain time frame. And in forest lands, we have a lot of rest time where we enter and we do a project and try to do as much as we can with mobilization at that point, and then we rest for a while and let trees grow, let natural processes have their way for a while. So this can be a difficult program with forest land. Some of the pitfalls, shortcomings I want to talk about, or hurdles that you might run into with trying to plan prescribed fire with NRCS programs. One in particular that comes up often and that I deal with a lot and try to work on with our leadership is missing scenarios or missing practices, practice standards that should exist, but maybe we don't have and we don't have a payment for. So one that comes up a lot is water supply development. In relation to prescribed fire, this can be critical depending on fuels condition and the type of burn being planned. Water supply development is not something NRCS can fund specifically or exclusively for the use of prescribed burning. Preparatory burning. This is an interesting category that I've been thinking about a lot more recently. I have clients doing some interesting things right now. This is what one person is doing, dealing with a sneaky type of ladder fuel in our oak woodlands. The moss that grows on these can be problematic in the drier time of the year when you might be conducting a prescribed burn as a ladder fuel that can fire can burn up the tree on the moss and then across a line if you have oaks on the edge of a line and then drop fuel on the other side. This particular client I have, and I know other people that do this, burns in the middle of winter the moss on some of our colder sunny days, eliminating that ladder fuel, and that could be a great preparatory practice in the winter before you're planning to do a prescribed burn. For example, that is not a scenario that NRCS has a specific payment rate for. Stump or log burning is another one that I've run into to reduce larger diameter, long duration smoldering fuels. That type of fuel can be a problem along fire lines, and we have a lot of large stumps and logs from legacy logging in places like northwestern California, and this is a creative practice that can help with the implementation later, but is not one that we have a specific payment rate for. Cultural and small-scale burning is really, a lot of people are very interested in it. We have a lot of tribal clients interested in it for obvious reasons, but we don't have particularly great specific scenarios for payment for that kind of burning. We might be able to work with it, but we all have to be creative to do it. And so that's something else that might be a little bit more difficult than usual. Repeated prep is a really important one. In particular, mowing, if you're working in grass fuels, mowing every year in preparation for a burn, you might have to do it several years in a row if you don't get the burn window that you want. NRCS doesn't necessarily have a repeated payment for multiple years of burning in a row that we can pay adequately for. We might be able to pay once for mowing, but if you have to do it several times, it can be problematic. Same thing with line construction. Deferred grazing is another one that comes up a lot in our rangelands or grazed forest areas. That is something that NRCS can pay for. And so this would be resting an area from livestock in order to grow more fuel, to facilitate burning, or to rest after burning has been completed. And then the payment that goes to the landowner is to offset the cost of having to move those livestock somewhere else. That's not something that's easily achieved in California with NRCS. It's something that I like to see more of, but it's difficult. Some of the other pitfalls, we have a rigid cost structure. So for the scenarios that we do have cost structures for or cost estimates for, that doesn't mean that that's going to match the real world cost very well, even if it's meant to be a percentage of total cost that we pay. Some of the cost rates that we get are derived nationally. So we have to work with some of those and can't necessarily change them all here in California. We can create some California specific scenarios, but we're limited on how many we can create. So that can be frustrating, and that rigidity can be difficult to be adaptable to, the real economics of the area that you are in and the variation in how to go about treating something or dealing with something, such as prescribed fire. Per acre, we know, is not a good measure of cost. NRCS pays for prescribed burning by the acre. That is not something that is apparently going to change anytime soon either that I can see. Burn plans are expensive in California. That's a national rate that we pay about $500 on average for them, but you might be spending $3,000 in California for a burn plan. Repetitive prep work is another one that I already talked about a little bit. And then the structure of a 3-year or a 5-year contract where you have to have something scheduled every single year, and that might not be optimal for what you're trying to do. This is an example of a bid on a 30-acre prescribed burn here in Humboldt County that I recently received. And so this just gives an example of, for 30 acres, you might be for a burn boss to write a burn plan and then burn boss for you, and that's the only resources that you're getting. You might be spending $10,000 for a 30-acre burn. That's a high bid, I would think, but probably not unreasonable compared to some other things you would see. There aren't a lot of contractors in California that do this anyway. Which brings me to limited technical support. Our staff in California is limited. NRCS California does not have a lot of staff that are with the agency that are qualified to write burn plans, to help implement burns, or even to just do some of the basic planning through our planning, 9-step planning structure. And so we're going to be looking to outside contractors to help do that kind of work. When you look outside the agency in the private sector, that's also extremely limited. That specialized workforce, it doesn't have a lot of representation in California. We do have one technical service provider that can implement prescribed fire as a burn boss in the state and who can write burn plans, but those people are few. So this is a severe bottleneck, and the bar set by NRCS policy is part of that bottleneck. And I'll talk about policy in the next part of the presentation, so please tune in for that. Some of the things that NRCS has done recently to help improve our program in relation to prescribed fire. One is to develop a few new scenarios for fire line or fire break. We have 2 for hand line construction now. So in our steeper terrain that we have on the North Coast and in some of our heavier fuels or our difficult terrain that we work in, hand line may be the best option in some areas. Prior to a few years ago, we did not have payment rates for hand line. We do now. We only have payment rates for dozer line, for example, or larger mechanical construction line. We still have those, but we now have these other options as well. We also created 2 new payment scenarios for prescribed fire itself to meet or match some of the ecosystems that we see a lot of people wanting to burn in California, or that we'd like to see burning in. We have one for our oak woodlands and associated grasslands for about $150 per acre on average. And then there is one also now for mixed conifer, evergreen forests, or other forests in California called timber litter and slash field types. And that pays almost $300 an acre. So those are good developments for our programs, hoping that we can facilitate some financial ability for clients to be able to conduct prescribed burning in California. We registered 1 technical service provider in California for prescribed burning. We're hoping to do more of that. We're actively seeking additional qualified people in the private sector that want to become technical service providers and go through that certification process with NRCS. We also identified 10 of our own staff and directed them to obtain qualifications through the agency so that they can work a little bit more with clients in developing contracts for prescribed fire. We're hoping that that can happen in the next year or so, but we'll see. We are strongly considering inclusion of the new California Burn Boss certification program, which is set to launch at some point this year. It is not official yet, but I want to put the disclaimer there that that's tentative. Our state leadership is responsible for determining whether or not we are going to accept that as a qualification that is allowable for implementation of prescribed fire on NRCS contracts or for writing burn plans. And the state office has not determined whether they will accept that or not, and they're waiting for the final release of that. So I just wanted to touch on what has been extremely helpful for my work and the clients that I work with on the North Coast in California, and that is the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association and the value of burn associations in general. These are landowner-led organizations. They focus on private lands burning. They build capacity and allow landowners to lead burns themselves. They provide sometimes equipment and other services that can be critical to being successful. And in Humboldt County, the Prescribed Burn Association here that formed a few years ago has been critical to NRCS's success, being able to help our clients conduct successfully prescribed fire. And I strongly encourage any of you out there that are in another part of the state where a Prescribed Burn Association is emerging or where you don't have one yet to form one or start to collaborate with the one that exists, because these organizations really have potential and build a lot of community around the concept of prescribed fire and working together. So some of the take-homes from this talk: NRCS supports prescribed fire and prep work where appropriate, financially and, if we can, with technical assistance, with some limitations, staff limitations. Many resource concerns can be treated with prescribed fire, but prescribed fire may be one of multiple alternatives. It may not be the only way to treat a resource concern. Beware of shortcomings of program assistance, whether it's NRCS or other programs. Programs come with their strings attached. NRCS cannot account for every scenario that you might encounter, and so that's something to always think about and be aware of. Costs can be much higher in NRCS in California than NRCS will offer. NRCS continues to make efforts to evolve and improve the delivery of our prescribed burning assistance. I expect that to continue. I encourage all of you to find collaboration, work with prescribed burn associations and others involved in prescribed fire as much as you can. Get to know your permitting agencies. You're going to need to work with them, as you don't have a choice in a lot of cases. There may be many pathways to reach your goals, so try to remain creative and think outside the box when you have to, and build or join a prescribed fire community. So that's part one, and thank you for tuning in. Please keep an eye out for part two and part three. I hope they'll be a little bit shorter than this one.